Hey, do you have a lot to say? Are you a poet? Do you write poems about how you feel about life, about everything? Well, our next guest did exactly that. She's written a number of wonderful books, and she's here to share it with us. My name is Vin Dacquino. Our next guest is Eleanor Lerman. Eleanor, what a pleasure to have you here.
Lovely to be here, Vin. Thank you.
Well, we're going to talk today about who you are and what you do. You've been writing for quite some time.
A very long time, yes. 40 years.
So tell me when this all started. When did you decide that you're going to say what you needed to say in poetry?
I don't think that it's something that you get to decide. I think it's something that you're born with, you're driven to do, and at
And
some
almost
point...
like a haunting?
In a way. That's an interesting way to put it. And at some point, you realize that the only way you're going to be able to express what you want is to write. You asked me an interesting question about knowing if I wanted to be a poet. I don't know that anybody ever says to themselves, that's what I want to do. For me, it was discovering the work of Leonard Cohen. Most people know as a songwriter, but I discovered his work as a poet. And I started reading his work, and I finally said to myself, I get it. I could do that.
Wow. Wow. Were there any particular themes of his or of yours that you said, not only do I want to write poetry, but I have a message to deliver?
When you're in school, the kind of poetry that they introduce you to is Robert Browning, that sort of work that if your kid doesn't really resonate, it's very hard to figure out what My Last Duchess means. So poetry was something that I didn't relate to, or Shakespeare, although now I certainly do understand Shakespeare's
sonnets.
Takes a while. Takes a while. But the difference is that when you find something that you can relate to, that you understand, and for me, when I found Cohen's work, it was the key to understanding that poetry wasn't something that was done deep in the past, but it was modern. It was a way that you could speak now as a young person. These were the sort of hippie days. And his work was about how he felt, rather than writing about nature or the sunsets. And so that, for me, was the key. You could talk about yourself in poetry.
Absolutely. And when I talk to young poets, that's one of the things I say. You know, I hear so clearly what you said about school. What we do is we get poets who are successful, and then we say that poet was successful, so we need to teach that poet in school. And what sometimes we don't realize is that poet was speaking to the people of his time or her time. And some of the things that poet was talking about, for example, Robert Frost is one of my absolute favorites. But Robert Frost writes about nature. Sometimes inner city kids don't get it, and can we be surprised? Sometimes Robert Frost would have a difficult time understanding some of the people who write about the city. No, you write about not necessarily you, but more about life. Is that right?
I think that when I started, you have to remember I was very young, I was 18, 19, 20, it was about me. And I think that's how most people start writing fiction, poetry, anything. They always say that your first novel is autobiographical, for example. So I think I started out writing about myself, but over time, what I kind of learned to do was to expand my field of vision, meaning also my voice, so that what I wanted to do was speak more about my generation, people my age, the transition from being a young person to being an older person, and the life that lies ahead of us. So I think I've kind of covered the waterfront on all those subjects.
Yeah, see, now, for me, I know that, and it's odd because it's what you said, that sometimes we write and it just sort of comes from inside of us. We're not purposely trying to write certain things. They're in us and they come out. And sometimes we look at it and we say, wow, I write a lot about being different. And I notice that in a lot of my writing, I'm saying again and again, it's okay to be different. It's okay to be who you are. It doesn't necessarily make you weird. It makes you unique. And it's okay to be unique. In fact, that's fashionable to be unique, especially today. So you really are talking about coming of age in a sense?
Yes, to a large degree. I mean, earlier, that's what I was writing about.
When we talk about earlier, you've written a number of books. What is the earliest?
Armed Love, which is right there,
Okay, here,
was
Armed Love.
published when I was 21. And that book was reviewed in the New York Times, a book review.
Wow.
And the Times book review said that if books of poetry were given ratings, Ms. Lerman's book would deserve a double X.
Wow.
And I use that book now when I do readings because that was so many years ago. And the worst line I can find in there that would have offended them so much was that vampires are happier when they're homosexual. I think that's probably still true. It also shows how prescient I was since I was writing about vampires so long before they became fashionable. But that, I think the Times felt, you're talking about 1973, that young girls should not be writing about sex, drugs, and rock and roll. However, that led me into a lot of trouble because I wasn't prepared for what Andy Warhol called your 15 minutes of fame. I was 21. I was really kind of an uneducated kid from the Bronx, and suddenly I was a personage, and I didn't quite know how to deal with it.
Yeah, and that really is true. That sometimes we don't realize that some of the writers that we follow age as their fame ages, and their way of thinking, the things they believe in, change also. It changes with the time too. Things that we wrote about in the 70s are still pertinent, but they were a different kind of pertinent in the 70s when we were fighting Vietnam and we were rebelling against everything, and it was a whole different world. And today, things that are highly acceptable were not acceptable at all in the 70s.
Yes, that's true.
And vice versa. So you've changed since Armed Love. Then from Armed Love, you went to...
a book that isn't there because it's very hard to find, and I have only one old precious copy
wow.
left, so it's sitting at home where it's resting. That was called Come the Sweet By and By. And after that book, I did not write fiction or poetry for about 25 years.
Wow.
I wrote a lot of nonfiction. But what happened because of those two books was, luckily and unluckily, I met a lot of very famous writers, men, and they were wonderful to me. I met Donald Barthelme and even Pynchon, Richard Stern. They were very good mentors. But again, I was a kid and I was afraid of them. And I thought that, being a poet was, I thought there was some sort of hierarchy. Like the most important thing was being a novelist. Under that was you could be a short story writer, and at the bottom was poets. So I thought, I've got to write novels. These guys write novels. They're all encouraging me to write a novel. I didn't have the slightest idea of how to write a novel. So I wrote a lot of unsuccessful nonsense. And that sort of put me off the path for a long time. Although, as I said, I did write a lot of nonfiction. My brother was a television producer. He was producing America's Most Wanted for a long time.
Wow.
So he and I kind of ghost wrote a lot of true crime books together, two books actually, from America's Most Wanted. And so I did that, and I did a lot of other nonfiction. It took me a long time to get back to poetry and to fiction. But once I did, I didn't stop.
Yeah, that's interesting because that kind of happened to me. I did Kiss the Candy Days Goodbye in '82. And I didn't publish again until I did Sybil Ludington, which was almost 2000. So it was a long time.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, so you went from there to...
After Our Missing Friend, Come the Sweet By and By, I went to The Mystery of Meteors, was the first book of poetry that I published after a very long silence, a disappearance from that scene. And after that, as I said, I've just pretty steadily kept writing.
Right.
I've published a couple of books since then. I also published a novel, a collection of short stories, and so I haven't stopped. I mean, once the floodgates opened again, they
Tell me
opened.
about the novel.
The novel is Janet Planet, and what I decided to do was to rewrite the life of Carlos Castaneda.
Wow.
Carlos was, in the 60s and the 70s, he was the big spiritual guru. And he wrote a lot of books that are still sold. They're still sold as nonfiction. His idea was that he had met a guru himself a spiritual guide somewhere in the desert named Don Juan, and he wrote many, many books about what this guru taught him, how to visit other worlds, other realms, etc., etc. He had many followers. In particular, 3 women lived with him who called themselves the Witches. Carlos was on the cover of Time magazine. It turns out that I think that he believed all this, but he was not, he was a fraud.
Whoa.
And at the end, the 3 women, he told them, when I die, as all great spiritual guides do, instead of dying in my physical form, I will burn up in fire. You will see me disappear in flame. Instead, what really happened was he got liver cancer.
Wow.
And the witches nursed him, and eventually he died, as a human being does. But they didn't know how to deal with this, and it is presumed that the 3 of them committed suicide.
Wow.
They found...
Together?
Not necessarily. One called the Blue Scout, probably she went on, just disappeared. They found the car, one of them, her car was found in Death Valley because apparently Carlos had told her, when I die, just get in your little blue car and drive.
Wow.
And she may have done that, gone into Death Valley and just driven until heaven knows what happened to her. So I was very disappointed in him, and I decided I would rewrite his life. And I would give him a better ending and make him a better person.
Wow.
So that's what Janet Planet is about.
Wow. It's cool. Now, that's actually your only novel, right, at this point?
At this point, yes. There will be more, but that for
Good.
now,
Wow.
yes.
So then you wrote short stories?
There is a book called The Blonde on the Train. That was a collection of short stories.
That's Resting with the Other One?
That's Resting with the Other One. That was a collection of short stories. But the poetry continues. Our Post-Soviet History Unfolds was a major book. That one, I was very lucky with that. It won a lot of awards.
I'm going to ask you something. I'm going to catch you a little off guard because we never talked about this. Is there a particular poem in one of these books that you would want to share with us today?
Sure. If you can give me Our Post-Soviet History Unfolds.
Okay. Let me do this without making things fall over.
There is a poem in here called Starfish that, I think it's in here, has taken on a life of its own. It is read all over the place. It is read in weddings, it's read at funerals, it's read at pet ceremonies, and I thought it was in here. Let's see, maybe it's not. You know what, you asked, oh, I got it. I got it, thank goodness. Okay. Starfish. I have to tell you, I thought at the end of this poem, you'll hear it, I was sending these starfish off to infinity, never to be heard from again, but apparently they speak to people because a week doesn't go by that I don't get an email about this.
Wow.
And someone doesn't say, I found your poem and I need to talk to you about it.
Wow.
So I have to say that this is a lovely poem. I'm not always such a lovely writer in person, but this is a very sweet poem. Starfish. This is what life does. It lets you walk up to the store to buy breakfast and the paper on a stiff knee. It lets you choose the way you have your eggs, your coffee. Then it sits a fisherman down beside you at the counter who says, last night the channel was full of starfish, and you wonder, is this a message finally, or just another day? Life lets you take the dog for a walk down to the pond, where whole generations of biological processes are boiling beneath the mud. Reeds speak to you of the natural world. They whisper, they sing, and herons pass by. Are you old enough to appreciate the moment? Too old? There is movement beneath the water, but it may be nothing. There may be nothing going on. And then life suggests that you remember the years you ran around, the years you developed a shocking lifestyle, advocated careless abandon, owned a chilly heart. Upon reflection, you're genuinely surprised to find how quiet you have become. And then life lets you go home to think about all this, which you do for quite a long time. Later, you wake up beside your old love, the one who never had any conditions, the one who waited you out. This is life's way of letting you know that you're lucky. It won't give you smart or brave, so you'll have to settle for lucky. Because you were born at a good time, because you were able to listen when people spoke to you, because you stopped when you should have and started again. So life lets you have a sandwich and pie for your late night dessert, pie for the dog as well. And then life sends you back to bed, to dreamland, while outside the starfish drift through the channel with smiles on their starry faces as they head out to deep water, to the far and boundless sea.
Wow.
So that's the poem that everybody seems to relate to.
Tell me about these comments that they make. What do they seem to connect to in this poem?
I didn't think it at the time. I honestly thought I was writing a poem about me and my dog. And it happens that I live at the beach, and if I look out my front door, I can see the water and I can see the ships. But I think it's the idea that floating off to infinity, which you can read as the afterlife or death, however you want to interpret it, the starfish are smiling. So I think they're going off to wherever they're going, feeling happy and feeling safe and confident that wherever they end up is going to be fine.
So then, is that life? You have your breakfast and you do what you have to do, and you satisfy your lover if you have one, or you satisfy yourself if you don't. And you go through life to the point where when you're ready to leave, you do. And you leave contented that you've lived a life?
Well, I think that's what we all hope will happen.
Yeah.
If you went through my work, you'd find a lot of poems where I say, no, maybe not. Maybe I was wrong about that. Maybe it's all very difficult and dangerous and scary. As a matter of fact, I think that's what Castaneda was getting about, which is why he was so attractive. Because his idea was that you had to find some power within yourself, I think, so that you could sort of command what your next life would be and command wherever you were, what other realms you went to. So I think there's a big arc between that kind of thinking, that if you're going to find other realms or other infinities, you have to be a warrior spirit there. And this poem, which is more about whatever happens, that's what happens, and I'll be okay with it.
Yeah, you know, I've spent a great deal of time with paranormals and with hauntings of the Hudson River Valley. And I also all of a sudden discovered that there is a possibility that this is not the end, this is the beginning, and that there is something beyond here. And I've been finding some amazing things and signs, you know, and it's almost as if, as you say, maybe these starfish are trying to tell you something. And I find the same thing with some of these spirits. I believe they're in some way or shape trying to communicate through me so that I could say some of the things that they would have liked to have said.
Mm-hmm.
So the majority, now you have a lot of books here.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of poems. Now, Starfish is very impressive.
Thank you.
Because it's written clearly, succinctly, it has a point, and I also like what you said about the fact that you wrote it thinking that you were writing a poem about your dog.
Yeah.
What it turned out to be is something that, for some people, makes connection. Poetry is that, isn't it? It's making a connection, trying to reach people on some level, whether it's an emotional level or an intellectual level. What level are you working in when you write? Do you have to get inside your head, or does it just flow?
You've asked a couple of questions. I'm going to try to answer all of them.
Answer all that.
I think to start with, the biggest mistake people make as writers is to think that they're waiting for inspiration. It has to be a job. It has to be something that you're disciplined to do and that you do every day, and you find the best time of day for yourself. You find out if you work better at night or you work in the morning, and then you do it. Right. Stephen King has always talked about having, the writer's couch. Almost every writer has a couch or a place where they sit. I happen to have a purple couch in my workroom, and I sit there with my dog, and every day or on the train, I'm going to work. Not always successfully, but it's sort of like opening the door that you get disciplined to open and now I'm going to look for what I'm going to do today.
It's amazing. I tell my writers, I told you I teach a writing course at college. And one of the things I always tell them is, you don't write a piece, you work a piece.
That's right.
And it comes from inside, but it doesn't just fall out of your head onto the paper. And okay, here it is. This is going to win every prize in poetry ever offered. It doesn't happen that way. You do have to work a piece. And people think because poems are short, everybody's a poet. But that's not necessarily true. Writing poetry, I think, sometimes is making contact with the inner you. It's finding out who you are and what you really think. And I love the idea of considering poetry to be poetherapy. It's a way of dealing with your life, your head, your thoughts, the things you see. We've been gathering information our entire lives. What do you do with it? Why are you gathering it if you're not going to work it and think about it and ponder it? Yes?
Well, that actually goes back to what you asked me before about, do you go inside your own head, or why are you writing? And I think that what you find if you're writing for a long time, in a disciplined way, is that you are writing because you want to, because you interest yourself, your own thoughts interest yourself. You're probably telling yourself stories all the time, probably from the time you were a kid. I was always telling myself stories.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, you're daydreaming, and you build on your daydreaming into actually making the stories into what you want them to be. So what you find is that you can't write for, what people are going to know when they read my work, or, how this is going to affect people. You have to sort of put everyone else away. And you're alone with yourself on the couch, and you're writing something because you're interested in it. If you put that passion and interest together with, and something you're born with, if you have the skill, then you've got a successful piece of work. And that's the difference between just, blathering on in writing and trying to actually discipline yourself.
And it takes time to believe in that, doesn't it? To gain that confidence. I taught a course to high school students, and it was called Co-ed Naked Writing. And the whole idea was that writing is bearing your soul. And it's almost like dropping your pants in public. You're showing a part of you that's vulnerable. And it's not only vulnerable as a piece, it's vulnerable to you. It represents what you stand for. One of my favorite quotes, though, is from Ray Bradbury. And someone asked him, they said, "Mr. Bradbury, how do you know when a piece is ready to go to the publisher?" And he sat back and he said, "I think the piece is ready when I can read from the first word to the last without making any changes." Well, that is a huge statement, because with some of my books, every single, even now that they're published, every time I read them, I can make changes, even though they're already out there. How about you? How long does it take to work your pieces?
It really depends. I mean, some of them
Just fall out.
When I was younger, I thought that you sat down on the couch at that time with a yellow pad, you wrote the poem, and that was it.
The poem's done.
That's right. I have learned that it makes for much better work if you are an objective editor. And that's a very important thing for a writer to understand, that not only do you have to write, you have to be your own editor, and you have to be ruthless with yourself.
Yeah.
Because not everything that comes out of your pen, your computer, is any good. And a lot of what you're going to write is not very good. I can't tell you how many times I've started things, even books, and put them away.
Me too.
And you have to be very comfortable with that. You have to have a thick skin in terms of being ruthless with yourself. You have to have a thick skin in terms of when you try to get published, you're going to get rejected a lot.
Yeah.
And you just have to keep going. But you have to be honest with yourself.
Yeah. And it's also important to know that you have to be satisfied with your work. If you share your poems with people who really don't appreciate poetry, and they say, "Yeah, it's all right," you can't take that and say, "Okay, that means I'm an okay poet." You're an okay poet to that person. Doesn't mean you're an okay poet. So you have to be very careful about who you share your work with and what your sounding board is out there. And you have to be satisfied with what you've created and what you've actually said. So now we're unfortunately counting down. Where do we go from here?
If I am lucky and if I can continue, which I plan to do, there'll be more poetry and there will be more fiction.
I just want to talk a second about publishing. Publishers, getting the work published. It's the difference between writing a poem and publishing a poem, yes?
Yes.
And hard work publishing, do you have publishers now ready for your work? Now that you've done all this, are there publishers waiting on their doorstep for your work?
Unless you're John Grisham and Stephen King, nobody's waiting for your work.
That's right.
It's a job.
Yep.
I'm very lucky with Mayapple Press, who will be publishing my next book, Strange Life.
We had her here, by the way. Judy was here. She's
Judy,
wonderful.
yes, Judy is lovely. But you have to really keep at it. You have to, if you're a poet, you look for literary journals. You get one piece published at a time. If you can build up a resume of having been published in literary journals, then it's a little bit easier to find a publisher for a book, but you have to work at it. You have to look for publishers.
And should poets read poetry?
That's the only way to learn to write anything.
There you
Nonfiction, fiction, or poetry is you teach yourself, and the way you teach yourself is by reading.
Yep.
You read people that you like.
And by being an observer of life itself.
Yes.
And trying to make decisions about what life really is.
Yes, and then using your skill and your imagination to turn it into writing.
Well, this has been informative for me. It has been exciting. Your work is wonderful work.
Thank you.
I enjoyed reading your poems. I urge people out there, go read Eleanor Lerman's work. You will be 100% pleased. She's a wonderful poet and a wonderful guest.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in today. Tune in tomorrow and all of the tomorrows to come. If you feel that you're a poet, write. Talkers talk. Writers write. Don't talk about it. Do it.